The afternoon was warm, the kind of early summer day when the air hangs heavy with the smell of freshly cut grass and the rhythmic chirp of cicadas. In the Thompson family's quiet suburban neighborhood, kids were finishing their after-school snacks. Dogs barked lazily behind fences, and the hum of lawnmowers rolled across backyards. 8-year-old Lila Thompson was crouched on the back patio, a box of sidewalk chalk spilled open beside her, each stick worn down from weeks of bright drawings on the concrete. She had been at it all morning. Hopscotch grids, flowers with petals as big as her head, and a half-finished rainbow that stretched from one end of the patio to the other. From the kitchen window, her mother, Karen, kept a casual eye on her daughter while chopping vegetables for dinner. Every so often she'd glance out, smiling faintly at the sight of Lila's messy ponytail bobbing as she worked on her masterpiece. Their golden retriever, Scout, lay in the shade nearby, thumping his tail lazily whenever Lila spoke to him. David Thompson, Lila's father, was still at work at the local hardware store, but planned to be home early. Karen was thinking about maybe setting up the grill, letting Lila have an ice pop before dinner, when a faint breeze stirred the curtains by the open window. She looked out again. Lila had stood up from her chalk drawing and was now tracing the worn path to the far end of the backyard, where an old wooden fence separated their property from the alley beyond. The fence was weathered, its once bright white paint faded to a soft gray, and the gate at the end, a stubborn thing that often stuck in humid weather, hung slightly ajar. Karen frowned but didn't think much of it. The kids in the neighborhood sometimes wandered between yards to chase a ball or follow a butterfly. She heard Lila laugh, a short, high sound, and then nothing. She kept chopping for another minute or two, humming along to the radio, until something in the silence pulled her attention back to the yard. Scout had lifted his head, ears pricked, staring toward the gate. Lila was nowhere in sight. "Lila?" Karen called out through the screen door, her voice light at first. No answer. She stepped out onto the patio, scanning the yard. The chalk lay where it had fallen, one piece crushed slightly underfoot. The gate at the far end swayed with the breeze, the latch hanging loose. Beyond it, the alley stretched in both directions, quiet and empty. Karen's stomach tightened. She called her daughter's name again, louder this time. Scout stood and trotted to the gate, sniffing at the gap before glancing back at her. Within minutes, Karen was out in the alley, her eyes darting to every backyard, driveway, and shadowed corner. She checked with the next-door neighbor, then the one across the alley, her voice rising with each unanswered call. A man a few houses down was unloading groceries from his car and shook his head when she asked if he'd seen a little girl pass by. By the time 10 minutes had passed, Karen's breathing was fast, her hands trembling as she fumbled for the phone. She dialed David at work first. "Check the house," he said, his voice already sharp. "Maybe she's inside somewhere." "She's not," Karen snapped. "She was just here, David. She was just here." The second call was to 911. Within 15 minutes, the quiet street was crowded with patrol cars. Officers fanned out on foot, knocking on doors, asking neighbors when they'd last seen Lila. Some joined the search through the nearby park. Others followed the alleys toward the main road. Karen stayed by the gate, wringing her hands, her mind a jumble of possibilities. Maybe Lila had chased a cat. Maybe she was playing hide-and-seek with another child. Maybe she'd got old. Ian turned around, but the longer the minutes stretched without an answer, the more those maybes twisted into something darker. A neighbor 2 houses over approached one of the officers with a hesitant look. "I did see a white van earlier," he said. "Parked down the alley maybe half an hour ago. Didn't think anything of it. Guy was just sitting there." The officer's head lifted slightly. "Could you describe him?" "Not really," the neighbor admitted. "Ball cap, sunglasses, might have been on the phone." Karen overheard and felt her knees weaken. As evening settled, floodlights were set up in the yard. The fence was examined, photographs taken, and Scout was walked through the alley in hopes he'd catch a scent. Volunteers began arriving from the community, forming small search teams that combed empty lots, drainage ditches, and wooded patches by the park. By midnight, there was still no trace. Karen sat on the back steps, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white, while David, pale and silent, leaned against the fence. The gate was now closed, a strip of yellow police tape fluttering in the night breeze. Somewhere beyond the reach of those lights and voices, Lila was gone, and no one knew how. The sun rose pale and cool the next morning, casting long shadows across the Thompson backyard. Dew clung to the grass, glittering faintly under the early light. But to Karen, the scene looked drained of color, as if the world itself had gone dull overnight. She hadn't slept at all. Neither had David. The two of them had sat at the kitchen table until dawn, jumping at every noise outside, waiting for someone to call and say Lila had been found. Instead, the only sound now was the low murmur of officers conferring near the back gate. A few were still moving slowly along the alley, others retracing the yard in careful, deliberate passes. Search and rescue dogs had been brought in at first light, sniffing through shrubs, flower beds, and the edges of the fence. Detective Harris, a stocky man with a worn leather notebook, approached Karen with a grim nod. "We're going to do another sweep of the fence. We've had a couple of officers go over it, but I want it examined inch by inch. Anything out of place, we log it." Karen just nodded. Her throat was dry, her hands cold despite the growing heat. Two officers moved methodically along the fence line, checking each slat, each post. They crouched low, using flashlights to peer into narrow gaps between the boards. Karen watched from the patio steps, hugging herself as if holding her body together. It was Officer Martinez who stopped first. He knelt, leaning closer to the base of one section where the wood had splintered slightly. "Here," he called out. Detective Harris joined him, crouching to look. With a gloved hand, Martinez reached in and pulled out a small piece of fabric, no larger than a playing card. It was caught deep between the boards, wedged into a jagged edge of wood. Even from a distance, Karen recognized the color. Soft yellow, with tiny blue flowers. Her breath caught in her chest. Harris straightened, holding it delicately. "Mrs. Thompson, does this look familiar to you?" Karen stepped forward, her legs unsteady. When she saw it up close, she felt the air leave her lungs. That's her dress," she whispered. "The one she was wearing yesterday." She reached out instinctively, then stopped herself, her fingers curling back. The fabric was frayed along one edge, the flowers faded from exposure, but the pattern was unmistakable. Karen could even see the uneven line of stitching along one seam, her own, from when she'd adjusted the dress to fit Lila better last spring. Harris passed it to another officer to bag as evidence. "The way it's wedged in there," Martinez noted, "looks like it was caught while someone was moving quickly through the gate. Could have been torn if she was pulled." Through. Karen's stomach churned at the implication. "Did anyone check this section last night?" Harris asked. One of the patrol officers nodded. "Yes, sir, but it's possible it was too dark to spot without getting right up close. And with all the grass and debris," Harris waved him off. "Doesn't matter now. We have it." David had been standing silently by the gate, staring at the spot where the cloth had been found. When Karen turned toward him, he met her eyes for the first time all morning. "This means she came through here," he said, his voice flat. "She didn't just wander off into the house or the street. Someone took her out of here." Karen felt a rush of panic. Then why didn't anyone see anything? How does someone take an 8-year-old in broad daylight? "That's what we're going to find out," Harris said firmly. By mid-morning, the fabric swatch was on its way to the state crime lab for analysis, to check for fibers, fingerprints, anything that might point to the person who had been with Lila. Officers canvassed the alley again, this time knocking on the doors of houses that backed up to it, asking if anyone had surveillance cameras or had seen a white van parked there in recent days. The neighbor who'd mentioned the van the night before was re-interviewed. He thought he might have seen the same vehicle in the area earlier in the week, but couldn't recall if it had been the exact same driver. Karen felt trapped in a nightmare loop. Every conversation seemed to circle back to that van, that gate, that missing stretch of time between when she'd last seen her daughter and when she noticed the silence. That evening, the local news ran a short segment on the search. The anchor showed a photograph of Lila in the yellow and blue dress, smiling in front of a lemonade stand from last summer. Beside it, the reporter held up a close-up of the recovered fabric, sealed in its evidence bag. Karen and David sat on the couch, watching, their hands barely touching. "This is good," David said after a moment. "It's something. They'll find whoever did that." But Karen just stared at the screen, the sound fading into the background. The little square of cloth seemed too small, too fragile, to carry the weight of the hope she wanted to place on it. Somewhere, she thought, that dress still existed. Somewhere her daughter still existed. And this tiny piece of fabric, torn, faded, caught between two splintered boards, was the only proof she had left. The first few weeks after Lila's disappearance were a blur of motion. Police cars in the driveway, reporters knocking on the door, volunteers combing every vacant lot and wooded trail within a 10-mile radius. Karen and David barely had time to think, each day swallowed up by interviews, press briefings, and the endless waiting for a phone call that might change everything. At first it felt like momentum. Leads were coming in, some vague, others more promising. Multiple people reported seeing a white van in the area around the time Lila vanished, but the descriptions were inconsistent. Some said it was an older model with rust along the sides, others swore it looked almost new. A few neighbors thought they'd glimpsed a man in a baseball cap behind the wheel. Detectives traced every registered van in the county, but most owners had airtight alibis. One man became a person of interest for a few days, a handyman with prior arrests for burglary, but nothing tied him definitively to the case. When they searched his home, they found no trace of Lila, no yellow dress, no evidence at all. The fragment of fabric from the fence came back from the lab with frustratingly little to offer. The only foreign fiber found was synthetic, the kind that could have come from a glove or a jacket lining. No fingerprints, no DNA. It confirmed what everyone already knew, that Lila had gone through that gate, but nothing about who had taken her. By the end of the first month, the search radius had expanded into neighboring towns. The Thompson family spent hours driving to follow up on tips called in by strangers, a girl spotted in a supermarket, a child who looked like Lila in a park 3 counties over. But each lead ended in disappointment. Sometimes the girl in question would turn and smile, and Karen's breath would catch for a second before the features resolved into someone else entirely. The media coverage began to shrink. The bright, hopeful headlines turned to short mentions buried in the back pages. Other stories took over the front: an election, a major fire, a celebrity scandal. The case was still active, detectives assured the family, but Karen noticed fewer officers coming by, fewer updates, fewer phone calls. 3 months after the disappearance, the Thompson backyard looked much as it had before. The fence repaired, the gate latch replaced, the chalk washed away by rain. But Karen couldn't bring herself to spend time out there. The patio felt like a crime scene, every corner holding a memory she didn't want to face. David coped differently. He buried himself in work, picking up extra shifts at the hardware store, staying late to help with inventory. At home, he spoke little about the case unless Karen brought it up. When she did, he'd nod along but rarely offered more than a short answer. She suspected it was his way of surviving, to not think about what they'd lost unless he had to. Karen couldn't do that. She started attending meetings for parents of missing children, sitting in church basements with others who knew the same hollow ache. She listened to their stories, some who had found their children, most who hadn't, and felt both comforted and terrified. Years began to slip past, marked not by birthdays or holidays, but by anniversaries of the day Lila vanished. Each year, Karen would post a photo of her daughter on social media, hoping someone might recognize her, even older, even changed. Detective Harris retired after 8 years on the force. His replacement, a younger detective named Foley, assured Karen he would review the case file with fresh eyes, but months went by without any sign of progress. By the 10th year, Lila's disappearance was no longer in the public memory. Only the people who had been there, the neighbors, the friends, the family, still thought of her regularly. Inside the Thompson home, one wall in the living room had quietly transformed into a shrine. Photos of Lila at school, on vacations, blowing out candles. Her artwork framed alongside the few toys Karen had kept, and in the center, behind glass, a handmade yellow dress identical to the one she'd been wearing the day she vanished. Karen had sewn it herself, not long after the first anniversary, because she couldn't stand that the original was gone. She made it exactly the same, down to the crooked seam she'd cursed herself for when she'd first made it. Sometimes she would stand there, running her fingers along the glass, trying to imagine what that dress would look like now. Would it be torn, stained, worn thin, or would it still be whole, folded away somewhere in a drawer? Every year she told herself that if she could just hold on long enough, someone would see something, someone would remember, someone would talk. She had no idea that the first real break in the case was still 2 years away, and it would come from a place she never could have imagined. It was a Saturday afternoon in early June, 12 years after Lila vanished. Karen had the television on in the background while folding laundry in the living room. The channel was tuned to the local news. She'd left it there after the morning weather report and hadn't bothered to change it. The anchor's voice was upbeat, covering a summer festival in the neighboring town. The camera swept over colorful booths, children with face paint, a marching band moving down the main street. Karen barely paid attention, her hands working on autopilot as she matched socks and stacked shirts. Then she heard the reporter's voice say, "And among the spectators, a young woman wearing what appears to be a vintage-style dress, catching the crowd's attention for its unusual design." Karen's head lifted. On the screen, the camera panned over the sidewalk where people stood watching the parade. And there, for only a second, the frame caught a girl standing at the edge of the crowd. She wasn't smiling, wasn't waving. She stood still, hands clasped in front of her, eyes fixed not on the parade, but on the camera itself. And she was wearing a pale yellow dress scattered with tiny blue flowers, the same pattern Karen had sewn 12 years ago. Karen's breath caught, her hands frozen in mid-fold. The shot cut away almost immediately to the next part of the parade. But it didn't matter. The image was burned into her mind. The dress had the same square neckline, the same hem that hit just below the knee. It even seemed to have that slightly uneven seam along one side. She dropped the laundry on the couch and fumbled for the remote, rewinding the recording. The shot was fleeting, less than 2 seconds, but when she paused it, zooming in as much as the DVR allowed, the details became sharper. The girl looked to be about 18 or 19. Her hair was longer and darker than Lila's had been at 8, but the shape of her face, the set of her eyes, it was enough to make Karen's heart hammer. She grabbed her phone and called David. "There was a parade on the news," she blurted the moment he answered. "A girl was there. She was wearing Lila's dress, the same one." David was silent for a beat. "Karen." "No, I'm telling you, it's hers. You need to come home now." Within an hour, Detective Foley was sitting in their living room, watching the paused image on their TV. He leaned forward, his hands clasped, studying the girl's face. "It's a low-resolution image," he said finally. "Hard to be certain. But yes, that's the same pattern from the original evidence photo of the fabric piece we found." "In your yard." Karen's voice trembled. "You think it's her, don't you?" Foley didn't answer directly. "Where was this filmed?" Karen pulled up the festival information from the broadcast. It had been held 2 towns over, less than 30 miles from where Lila had disappeared. "We can start with the news station," Foley said. "Get the raw footage, higher resolution. See if they caught her on another camera. Maybe someone else in the crowd recorded something on their phone." Karen nodded, her pulse racing. For 12 years she had imagined every possible way this day could come. A phone call, a knock at the door. But she had never pictured it starting with a random parade on a sunny afternoon. By that evening, the police had secured the station's full broadcast tape. They sent the image to facial recognition analysts, comparing it against Lila's childhood photos adjusted for age progression. The preliminary result was inconclusive, but not dismissive. The footage revealed one more detail. As the camera had swept past, the girl had shifted slightly, revealing the hem of her dress. Near the bottom was a faint stain, brownish, irregular. In the same spot Karen remembered mending years ago after Lila had dropped her ice cream cone in the yard. It wasn't just a dress that looked like Lila's, it was Lila's dress. Karen lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying the image over and over. Was the girl looking at the camera because she recognized it was filming, or because she recognized herself, and knew that somewhere, someone watching might recognize her too? The next morning, Detective Foley arrived at the Thompson home with 2 more officers and a laptop. He didn't waste time on small talk. "We've pulled all available footage from the festival," he said, setting the laptop on the kitchen table. "We think she shows up in at least 3 SEP. Rate shots, Different cameras, different angles. Karen and David leaned in as he opened the first clip, raw, unedited video from a stationary camera the news crew had placed near a main intersection. The parade floats rolled past, children waved, the band marched. Then, as the crowd shifted, the girl appeared again. This time, the shot lingered a fraction longer than in the live broadcast. Her face was partially in shadow, but it was clearer. She wasn't smiling, wasn't clapping along to the music. She was scanning the crowd around her, her eyes darting in brief, sharp movements. "She looks like she's looking for someone," Karen said quietly. Foley clicked to the second clip, taken from a handheld camera. The cameraman had been moving through the crowd, capturing reactions. As he panned across, the girl glanced up, and for just an instant, their eyes seemed to meet. Her expression changed, a flicker of something unreadable. Then she turned and moved out of frame. "Doesn't look startled," David observed, his voice low, more like deliberate. The third angle was grainier, from a traffic camera mounted on a pole at the edge of the festival route. The resolution wasn't good enough for detail, but you could see her moving toward a side street, slipping between two groups of people. "Timestamps put these shots about 7 minutes apart," Foley explained. "We think she was moving through the crowd, not staying in one spot, possibly trying not to be noticed." Karen's hand was tight around her coffee mug. "And no one else saw her?" "We've canvassed," Foley said. "A few vendors remember a girl in a yellow dress, but no one spoke to her. We're working on getting permission to pull security footage from nearby businesses." They spent the rest of the morning with Foley pausing and replaying each clip, zooming in on every frame where the dress appeared. In one shot, the girl was holding something small in her left hand, a folded piece of paper, or maybe a thin booklet. The image was too blurry to identify it. By mid-afternoon, Foley had a plan. "We're going to circulate still images of her to every law enforcement agency in the region. Quietly for now. No public release until we know more. If she's Lila, we don't want to spook her or whoever she might be with." Karen felt torn between hope and dread. If it was Lila, why hadn't she come forward? And if it wasn't, if this was all just coincidence, how much more disappointment could she endure? That evening, Foley called again. "We got a partial hit from a bakery's outdoor camera near the festival," he said. She passed by about 15 minutes after the parade ended, alone, heading toward the waterfront. Karen clutched the phone tighter. "Did the camera catch where she went?" "Not exactly," Foley admitted, "but we know which pier she walked past. We'll check if any boats were docked there, see if anyone remembers her." Karen hung up and sat in the quiet kitchen. Through the window, she could see the backyard, the same fence, the same gate. The image of the girl in the yellow dress, standing in the crowd, had already fused with that of the 8-year-old who had vanished from that very spot. And now, for the first time in 12 years, the gap between those two images felt just a little smaller. The pier was quiet when Detective Foley and his partner arrived 2 days later. It wasn't tourist season yet, and the air smelled of salt and engine oil. Weathered fishing boats bobbed lazily in their berths, ropes creaking against the posts. Foley made his way to a squat wooden building at the entrance, where an older man sat on a stool, mending a net with hands as gnarled as the dock planks. His baseball cap was sun-bleached, the bill frayed. "You run this place?" Foley asked. 40 years, the man replied without looking up. Foley pulled a still image from the bakery footage. The grainy frame of the girl in the yellow dress, her profile visible as she walled. Ked passed the camera. "You see her on the day of the festival, June 3rd? The man squinted at the picture, leaning in, his fingers stilled on the net. "Yeah, I remember her. Stood out. On account of the dress. Haven't seen something like that in years." "What was she doing?" "Came down the pier alone, walked slow, like she was looking at the boats. Then she stopped at the end, talked to a guy on the Silver Bell, stayed maybe 2 minutes, then left." "Can you describe him?" The old man scratched his jaw. "Tall, maybe late 50s, gray beard, keeps to himself mostly. Name's Carl, runs charters for tourists, fishing trips and such." Foley exchanged a look with his partner. "He docked here now?" The man shook his head. "Took the boat out that afternoon. Didn't come back till after dark." They thanked him and crossed to the slip where the Silver Bell was tied. The boat was modest, its white paint dulled by years of sun, but it looked well kept. Foley knocked on the deck rail. A few moments later, a man emerged from the cabin, tall, bearded, wearing a faded windbreaker. His eyes flicked to the badges in Foley's hands. "What's this about?" Foley held up the photo. "You spoke to this girl on June 3rd. Can you tell us about that?" Carl frowned, glancing at the image. "Yeah, she came by, asked if I was taking passengers. I told her the boat was booked for a private trip. She didn't seem disappointed, just thanked me and left." "Did she say her name?" "No, she had an accent though, couldn't place it. Soft, like she didn't talk much." Foley nodded. "Which direction did she go when she left?" "Toward the far end of the waterfront. There's a back lot down there. Some folks park there to avoid the Main Street crowd." That was enough for Foley. They checked the back lot later that afternoon. It was mostly gravel, bordered by a rusted chain-link fence. A few weeds poked through the cracks in the asphalt. In the far corner, a security camera was mounted on a leaning utility pole. Foley made a note to request the footage immediately. If the GL had gotten into a car or met someone there, they needed to know. Back at the station, Karen sat in a side room, waiting for news. Foley stepped in after making the footage request. "We're close," he told her. "We've got her on camera at the pier, and now we're tracking where she went after. If she's still in the area, we'll find her." Karen searched his face. "And if she's not?" "Then we follow her trail," Foley said simply, "wherever it leads." For the first time in years, Karen didn't feel like those words were just routine. This time they had something real. And it was moving. The call from the waterfront security office came the next morning. Detective Foley was in his car within minutes, pulling up outside the modest municipal building where the footage was stored. The clerk, a young man with a scruffy beard and an oversized hoodie, had already queued up the relevant segment on a battered desktop monitor. "Camera's old, but it's something," he said, swiveling the screen toward Foley. The timestamp read 4:42 p.m., just over 20 minutes after the parade had ended. The frame showed the far edge of the back lot, the gravel corner Carl had described. A few vehicles were parked in uneven lines, and the shadow from the waterfront buildings stretched long across the ground. Foley leaned in. The girl in the yellow dress entered from the left side of the frame, walking with the same steady, unhurried pace seen in the earlier festival footage. She didn't look around. She didn't hesitate. She went straight toward the back corner, where a dark van was parked, half hidden behind a larger truck. "Pause it there," Foley instructed. The clerk froze the frame. The van's side door was open. A figure stood beside it, tall, wearing a cap pulled low over his face. His build didn't match Carl's. Foley scribbled a note, "Unknown male number 2. Run it forward slowly." The GI. Carl stepped into the shadow of the truck, disappearing from view for a moment. Then the tall man moved aside, and she climbed into the van without looking back. The man followed, sliding the door shut. "Do we get the plate?" Foley asked. The clerk shook his head. "Camera's too low, angle doesn't catch it, but we can see the rear when it leaves." They advanced the footage. 43 seconds later, the van pulled out, heading toward the side street that connected to the main coastal road. No readable plate, but Foley noted the make and model. A late 90s Dodge Ram, faded green, with a dent on the passenger side panel. Foley exhaled slowly. "Can you burn me a copy of this?" By late afternoon, Karen and David were at the station, sitting in a small viewing room. Foley played the footage without commentary. Karen's hand flew to her mouth as she watched the girl walk into the corner, then into the van. "She didn't fight," Karen whispered. "She just went." David's brow furrowed. "Maybe she knows him, or thinks she does." "That's one possibility," Foley said. "The other is that she's under someone's control, and what you're seeing is compliance, not choice." Karen stared at the frozen final frame, the van pulling away, the gravel dust hanging in the air. "What now?" she asked. "Now," Foley replied, "we find that van. Every business, every gas station camera along the coastal road. Someone saw it." That night, long after Karen and David had gone home, Foley sat alone in his office replaying the footage over and over. There was something in the girl's posture, the way she carried herself, that nagged at him. Not fear, not confusion. It was almost as if she knew exactly where she was going. The next 72 hours became a blur of phone calls, security footage requests, and endless drives along the coastal highway. Every gas station, roadside diner, and motel within a 100-mile radius was contacted. Most owners were polite but unhelpful. "Can't say I saw anything," while a few grudgingly pulled their tapes for review. It was at 3:14 a.m. on the third night, in a darkened evidence room lit only by the glow of a monitor, that Foley finally got something. A grainy security clip from a small marina, time-stamped the same evening as the festival, showed the green van pulling in around 6:15 p.m. The footage was old and a little warped, but the dent on the passenger panel was there. The van idled for nearly 30 seconds before the tall man got out. He was wearing the same cap as in the parking lot video. His stride was slow, deliberate, as he walked into the marina office. He returned less than a minute later with a set of keys clutched in one hand. Then, almost casually, the side door slid open. The girl in the yellow dress stepped out. Even through the grainy pixels, Foley noticed the same strange calm in her movements. She glanced toward the water, then turned to face the man. They exchanged a few words, silent on the footage, and she followed him down the dock toward the slips. "Pause it," Foley said to the clerk. "Zoom in as much as you can." The image broke into blurred blocks of color, but the dock number came into focus. Slip 17. The clerk checked the paper logbook on the counter, flipping through pages marked with coffee stains and sun-faded ink. Only one departure at that time. The Aurora Dawn. Foley frowned. "Who owns it?" The clerk tapped the page. "Belonged to a guy named Malcolm Reeves back in the 90s. Sold in '09 to an LLC out of state. Haven't seen her dock here in years until that night." Back at the station, Foley dug deeper into the registry. The shell company that purchased the Aurora Dawn had no real address, only a P.O. box in another state. No corporate filings, no tax records, no paper trail. Whoever had the boat now clearly wanted to disappear behind a layer of obscurity. The next morning, Foley returned to the marina. The Aurora Dawn was gone. The slip was empty, just frayed ropes tied to the posts and the faint smell of diesel hanging in the air. Carl, the fisherman from earlier, was sitting on a crate, sipping coffee from a metal thermos. When Foley showed him the grainy printout, Carl nodded. "Yeah, saw her pull out that night," Carl said. "Tide was going out fast." They left quiet. No music, no chatter, just motored past like they didn't want to be noticed. "Any idea where they might have gone?" Carl shrugged. "This time of year? Could head south for the coves or out toward the islands if they had the fuel. You don't just stumble across those spots. You've got to know exactly where you're going." That last line stuck with Foley. 3 days later, a call came from a fisherman 50 miles north. He said he'd found something caught between the jagged rocks along a remote stretch of shore, something pale yellow, tangled with seaweed. When Foley, Karen, and David arrived, the wind was sharp and the surf pounded against the stones. The fisherman pointed them toward a crevice near the tide line. Karen stepped closer. It was a scrap of fabric, frayed at the edges and stiff with salt water, pale yellow with faded blue flowers. Her knees felt weak. "It's hers," she whispered. David reached out, brushing the cloth gently between his fingers, as if afraid it might dissolve. "It's been in the water a long time," he murmured. Foley crouched, scanning the surrounding rocks. No footprints, no fresh disturbances. The tide had been high the night before, which meant the fabric could have traveled from anywhere along the coastline, or been deliberately placed. "Could the currents bring it here?" David asked. "Maybe," Foley said. "But the question is, from where?" Karen stared out at the horizon, the wind pulling strands of hair across her face. "Or by whom?" she added softly. The fisherman had nothing more to offer, no other debris, no sightings of the Aurora Dawn, nothing unusual besides the scrap of cloth. Back at home that night, Karen spread the fabric on the kitchen table, smoothing it out like a fragile relic. Her mind drifted to the image of the girl in the yellow dress, staring into the camera at the festival, the smallest flicker of recognition in her eyes. "Why didn't you run?" Karen whispered into the empty room. Foley, meanwhile, stayed late at the precinct, replaying the marina footage for the 20th time. The way the girl had followed the man onto the boat, the lack of hesitation, the subtle way she kept her gaze forward. It didn't read like fear. It read like intent. The file remained open, but leads thinned as summer turned to autumn. The green van was never located. The Aurora Dawn was never reported again in any port registry. Still, Karen never stopped scanning faces. In grocery store lines, in the background of news reports, in the corners of festival photos. Because once you've seen your missing child step into the world again, even for a moment, the search is no longer about closure. It's about the next time she turns up, and whether she's coming closer or moving further away.